Hello, this is Zara Richter. This is the Facing Autonomy podcast. Here's my co-host, Sierra Lee.
Yeah, we're talking about me. My name is Cher, and I'm just excited about today's show.
We're talking about the theses on the George Floyd Rebellion. That's on illwilleditions.com/theses on the George Floyd Rebellion. Go ahead and give that a Google search if you're listening. You can follow along with what we're talking about. To talk about that, we have one of the authors of this piece on with us, Arturo.
Hello, I'm Arturo. I think we wrote this as like a strategy document, and just to think about what's happening, and also maybe to challenge people to think about this in a little more nuanced way. And I think there's a lot of points that can be countered. There's a lot of counter arguments that can be made because of that. Because we're just trying to open a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I mean the idea is to have a debate, for it to be a discussion.
Yeah,
because there's some points that I've gotten a bunch of critiques from people that I think are very valid.
Mm-hmm.
For example, one thing I've heard from some people, more like Black comrades, it somewhat undervalues and underestimates the role that Black revolutionaries played, more kind of like organized elements within the Black left, in setting the tone
yeah,
of the rebellion, and the whole kind of like Jamesian orientation that we have. We're kind of like emphasizing the spontaneity of things and the way that it was more informal and organic. But
mm-hmm.
I think there was an organizational structures at play as well, which the piece doesn't necessarily get into that much. Another thing was, I don't know. One thing I've heard is that it overgeneralizes the division between the Black middle class and the Black poor,
Mm-hmm.
and that maybe that wasn't always the case. That you there are situations where you do have Black proletariats in these NGOs.
Yeah,
It's not always so clear cut. And yeah, that is like a real tension, but at the same time, that's not necessarily always the case. And then another thing is, I guess we've gotten some pushback on this kind of emphasis on working class unity and trying to foster multiracial solidarity. Just the barriers that exist to that, and how do you avoid a situation where the autonomy of the Black struggle becomes diluted and compromised
yeah,
through these, building this solidarity. And that's a thing that CLR James had his own take on, that he criticized a lot. This idea of Black and white unite and fight, that often can undermine
yeah.
the autonomous potential of the Black struggle.
What's your take on it, Zara?
Well, I mean, I'm really interested in this first issue that was brought up about whether, to what degree Arturo and Chemin's piece puts faith in the Black leadership of the George Floyd rebellion. And I'm really interested in a parsing of what it means to be Black led, and I think that's an important conversation a lot of people are having right now. The other week there was a great conversation
Mm-hmm.
between No Name and Boots Riley on the Haymarket cast, kind of discussing the protests, and there was some debate about how much of it was theoretically kind of influenced and how much of it was just spontaneous and led by people who were not heavily read in theory. So I think that gets to this question is, can something be Black led without having the Black people that led it, have theoretical approaches or formal positions in orgs? Can it be Black led without any of the Black leadership, taking credit in all these ways or putting their name out there or something like that? And that's a major question we need to parse. Can the Black leadership not be trying to make a name out of their actions? And might that be what they would do if they were going to do more militant actions in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Arturo, you want to put your 2 cents in on that?
Yeah, I mean, from what I saw on the ground, this is just my experience, and it's limited and partial. I mean, I guess I can try to like follow what has been happening through the news and the media as much as I can, but like just being in the Northeast, a lot of just like young Black people that weren't part of the established left initiating the riots.
Were or weren't?
That initiated the riots, and then there was a lot of like more established kind of like leftists like coming from the Black left who definitely played a role, but then there was a lot of people that had nothing to do with the left at all that I saw that were like the main kind of like initiators of like sparking the riots and like the more
Yeah.
militant tactics on the streets.
And you mentioned that like the geographical element, most of the people arrested were pretty much local, right?
So
From
far,
the
yeah.
communities and sort of people on the ground in everyday life, right? Who had some sort of, solidarity with that.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
Hmm.
Which doesn't mean that there wasn't like organizers and activists that were part of that, that were coming from other places. I mean, I myself like went around to some other places.
In terms of what Zara was talking about, I think like there's class struggle within the Black community. That's definitely true. Like I just, I'm not as acquainted with, what are the sort of issues, but I feel like, there's always been, this tension between like nationalists or like, like sort of movements along these lines. In Pakistan, for example, the PTM, a lot of the left groups, had a very like uneven sort of relationship, with the actual demands, and sort of politics taking place. Like it was from a little bit of a different perspective for the Black community. Like, I think like they have their own sort of conditions of class struggle or context, which sort of, is taking place, which I think is what CLR James is also talking about in Facing Reality, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, where I'm at in Philadelphia, which is like it's a city, like it's very much like a Black city. That you see that a lot, definitely.
Yeah.
And even there were situations where shit got violent between people, but like on different, like in terms of like the looting, especially, like
Yeah.
that seemed to me to be like the main point of tension where, like more middle class Black people were like willing to like fight other Black people over. I think it's maybe like overgeneralizing to say that that was happening like all around, but
Hmm.
it was definitely happening. And
Hmm.
from what I understand, in some parts of the country, like people got killed. Like there was like like security guards that ended up like getting in like shootouts and like all kinds of stuff in those kind of situations.
And what is thinking around the role of like left parties or sort of anarchist groups or various other things, various other sort of activisms which sort of have merged with some of the movement and that whole relationship between the traditional left and the autonomous Black movement, right?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to go ahead, Zara? Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I do want to hear the answer to that question as well in just a minute. But the topic of the outside agitators that you bring up around point two is really interesting, and it resonates with some work, particularly by anarchist feminist scholar Cindy Milstein, who wrote about outside agitators a decade or so ago, and wrote about how that was something that was used to shame solidarity from outside of the Black community in Black-led uprisings. That notion of outside agitators dates back to the 1950s. So this is a rhetoric which you've seen, over and over again, used to essentially, shame solidarity work from non-Black POC or white folks who are coming out there and acting in solidarity, sometimes acting in a militant way. But I really think it's a distortion led by the capitalist media and the liberal nonprofits to suggest that it was so-called leftists acting in solidarity that were doing most of the property destruction oriented protests, right? I do think that that's a distortion which is meant to kind of cover over how locally based it is in a lot of these cities that people are responding to, the conditions that they're living in, which are conditions of disposability, conditions where police can kill based on the slightest suspicion, and conditions where people are so reliant on very low paying jobs and barely any healthcare that they also feel there's a level of disposability, and that core experience of disposable Black life is the primary agitator. If there's any agitator making these protests go on, it's not someone from the outside. It's an internal experience of Black communities across U.S. major cities. It doesn't require Marx or Kropotkin to experience that and recognize that one of many valid responses is rage against the system.
Yeah, the whole outside agitator thing is bullshit. It's been going on for so long. It happens every time. Like, it's the return of the outside agitators every time. But like you're saying, the police are the outside agitators. The U.S. government are the outside agitators. And like, it's part of the political repression that took place against the rebellion. Even within the left, like there was people that call themselves anarchists and socialists that were pushing that kind of rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Because what the self-activity, the self-mobilization went beyond the purview of their organizations, and it just made them uncomfortable.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
And they can't conceive of the fact, that like white people, like Asian people, indigenous people, Latinx people would have a stake in the struggle against the police state and against capitalism. It's just inconceivable to them.
Mm-hmm.
But it's bullshit. It makes me really mad because then a lot of people buy into it.
Yeah. And I think, that's what I really liked about this piece. It's sort of a direction, a new direction in terms of what left parties can do and how they should view their solidarity,
Right.
sort of developing a critique around that. And I feel that you even see it with like Jacobin magazine. They were pretty exposed during this whole crisis, and the way they sort of overdetermined class in that sense, and were being really reductionist in their understanding of sort of what was taking place.
Yeah.
And it probably gives you insight into why like Bernie's politics was unable to develop links in communities. It was primarily like liberal sort of civil society sort of spaces, right? In which they were, trying to communicate their discourse or whatever.
I think the discussion of outside agitators, it really shows how this revolt was arising from the poorest Black communities and not from people in positions of of leadership in nonprofits, or not from people in positions of leadership in left parties, or not even from people who are necessarily even running like anarchist reading groups somewhere. The people really initiating this were not doing any of those things. That's what it seems to be in your thesis and on your point 6, Arturo, which I think point 6 is one of the best points, because I also witnessed in DC that I was around just at the end of the first weekend of it, and then I overheard how a lot of it was turning into a parade. And so I think the timeline there on number 6 about when it was militant and when it ceased to be is really and also these points about counter revolution, and how in this instance, as in many instances, the left, which is of course the white left, acted in a way which was to kind of repress or the revolutionary tendencies of the people that were originally out from May 26th to June 1st. And that you're still seeing that today, is that a lot of the activism present right now is kind of counter-revolutionary activism against that initial, kind of break, that moment of breakage, that moment of rupture, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, I was surprised by some of the people that I heard pushing that line. about outside agitators and about fascists, like possibly starting like some of the more like rioting, looting tactics, and then possibly foreign agents, that want to destabilize the United States. And it was wild. It was baffling to me that it came from people that call themselves socialists and anarchists, even.
Mm.
And yeah, going forward, it's like I don't know, just definitely revealed like where people stand.
Yeah.
Because this is going to keep happening. This whole situation is not going away.
Mm-hmm.
All the factors that produced it are still there.
Yeah. So, Arturo, I was going to ask a quick question. In the piece, you termed riots and sort of mobilization as like rebellions. Sort of what was the reasoning behind that,
Uh, calling it rebellions, like as opposed to just riots
or insurrection,
or
or
insurrection. Like
Mhm,
the way I understand an insurrection is that it's an organized assault against state power
mhm,
in a moment of crisis, in a moment of like upsurge.
yeah,
Whereas like a rebellion or an uprising are kind of just like expanded forms of riots, which are kind
yeah,
of like more uncontrollable, unpredictable, spontaneous.
yeah.
Whereas a lot of people use all those terms interchangeably, like riot, rebellion, insurrection. So I guess I see an insurrection as kind of like a more organized thing where it's like people trying to take power.
No, no, that's well said. So, like the discussion around, sort of, you see a lot of the like ML sort of, like Jody Dean, talking about the need to organize crowds. What do you think the role of like organization can be in sort of, everyday, sort of organizing? Or you see a lot of the Socialist Alliance people, they talk about like, we have to get a third party, right? Obviously, we've seen how that turns out typically. But do you think, it expands the scope of like potentially like autonomous organizing, like mutual aid or direct action or those sort of things?
Well, I mean, like or people trying to like organize the crowds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it can. I guess it just depends, like the method that people use. I don't know. I guess I am like averse to like this idea that you need to just organize people and then there's going to be like a revolution or something like
Yeah.
that, or then there's going to be like real changes and transformation. I'm like very influenced by CLR James and his interpretation of Marx and also Hegel, which is, I mean, I think the best metaphor is to like hold up a mirror
Hmm.
to the self activity of the
Hmm.
class and to help expand that self activity, the revolutionary tendencies of that self activity.
Hmm.
And or like another metaphor I've heard that I think is good is it's like the role of revolutionary should be like to act as a prism that
Yeah.
refracts the self activity of the class into like a wider, more expansive direction. But that's very abstract. But yeah, I mean, we should be engaging with the ways that people are already building forms of like revolutionary struggle on their own, and we
Hmm.
we should be supporting that, and we should be trying to participate in that and engage with it, and also oppose the reactionary counter-revolutionary tendencies within it, rather than trying to impose ourselves on the autonomy of
Yeah.
people in their self-mobilization, self-organization, and trying to like fit it into our preconceived conception of how a revolution should happen, and that we're going to train people in a certain strategy or a certain framework, and then like real emancipation can happen. All of that is
Hmm.
problematic. I think. I tend to agree with James's critiques of the Vanguard Party and
Hmm.
that whole like approach.
So, what is your take about the demands for defunding or the police, or like, trying to get community policing or sort of these other, sort of like in between sort of social democratic sort of demands, right? Like liberal demands around the police and those sort of thing. What's your take on that?
I think it arises from people trying to change things within the existing system, and it's not a bad thing. But there is it also at the same time narrows down the realm of possibility
Mm-hmm.
and what can happen, and it ignores the black revolutionaries who have been saying for a very long time that we need to just straight up destroy and eliminate
Mm-hmm.
the policing and prison system.
Mm-hmm.
But and also even like there's places in the United States where specific policing agencies have been disbanded technically, like in Camden, for example, and a new bourgeois society still goes on and it restructures itself, and new forms of policing emerge, which can in some cases be worse. Like now they disbanded the Metropolitan Police Department in Camden, but the county police, the Camden County Police, basically ended up taking over, and there's technically more police now
Yeah.
in Camden. So I mean, it has to be taken with a grain of salt. But I don't want to be like dismissive altogether, because I think that it is important, and there are a lot of people doing a lot of good work around defunding the police.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it doesn't get at the question of how do we eliminate capitalism and
Yeah.
build a revolutionary movement that can overcome capitalism.
Yeah.
And some of the people who talk about defunding the police, place that in a broader program of police abolition, and that's at least a more interesting argument than those who just say that alone, and say that defunding the police alone is going to do it. Placing it in a broader program alongside, and I do want to get to this in a minute, alongside this idea of ending union solidarity with the police and ending qualified immunity and ending all these privileged statuses. I have heard this argument, and I'm not sure if I believe it, but I've heard this argument that, I guess like incremental, eventual, complete, abolition of the police, it can be done. That you can push all these micro reforms that eventually lead to a holistic, abolish the police platform. And I like that idea at the same time, but I also have some reservations, right? But I've seen that idea be implemented. It seems like where people are making progress within unions is also floating an idea like that, is telling these smaller institutions that we're going to do this thing as part of this broader platform of police abolition. And so the the cross world approach to police abolition of saying we're going to abolish it in all these different places, that appeals to me. But the idea of a bunch of incremental reforms and policy that do that appeals to me less. So it appeals to me that all these autonomous groups could all take little actions that build up to a total abolition of the police. But at that point, you still have to keep doing actions like that to abolish policing itself, to follow thinkers like, say, Angela Davis before she kind of got a little bit more politically liberal.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, what's missing from a lot of stuff is just that the fact that the riots and the militant self-activity is what put all of this on the table. And without that, none of these changes would be possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's talk about unions right now. Unions occupy a certain percentage of the theses that you helped to write. Tell me what do you think? Is it completely radical for unions to take internal like liberal union reforms against working with cops, or is that part of a bourgeois aesthetic of reform? What do you think?
There's a lot of lip service being paid right now to like anti-racism and being against police brutality, and I think that's part of it. And people are being pressured and being forced to take that position. And it doesn't necessarily mean that these unions are going to be like revolutionary abolitionists. But I think it's important. It's good. I think it's good. I mean, objectively, like it is a good thing. But I think part of it is they want to be legitimate. It's part of their they want to make their image more legitimate in the eyes of this mass movement. And you have Amazon, and all these corporations saying that they're going to not, collaborate with the police in very specific, limited kinds of ways. They have Black Lives Matter slogans. But but that work's important. I mean, people should be trying to push that within unions, within labor organizations, or wherever they're at, in schools and all kinds of places.
I sometimes feel like the whole ambit of unions has sort of been so narrowed over the years. Like, you know, strikes, like the way strikes have been criminalized, and then just sort of, you know, the conservative bent of certain unions, like, transport unions, or I don't know. It's just like a weird sort of situation with the unions.
Yeah, I think also capitalism has changed a lot too. That makes unions not as disruptive as they were before, and the ability for strikes to really throw capitalism into a crisis is not the same as it was when you had mass industrial employment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think automation has changed a lot of things, and the fact that growth is slowing in terms of industrial production has changed a lot of things, and
Yeah.
that's that needs to go into any kind of strategy, any kind of labor strategy, or union strategy.
The point about unions kind of adopting these points, the plea for survival, is very interesting because I there is some evidence that we have experienced in the past 3 to 4 years, among the younger generation, a greater degree of unionization than what was going on for like 40 or 50 years between the 2010s, the late 2010s, and 1970. There was a dead zone of union activity, and only in that last year there's a huge kind of wildcat teacher strike in West Virginia that completely transformed the discourse on teaching, and so the idea that unions unions of the past were essentially made irrelevant by the civil rights struggle that was going on, in the 60s and 50s. And
Yeah.
I think that the new wave of unionism today is very nervous about that happening again. So I think they're at least trying to take the most minimal position that they need to be seen as remaining relevant. So it's very interesting from that perspective, is that this wave of unionism is trying to be more collaborative with the new left, because they're seeing even the cold hard capitalists trying to do that at least the capitalists are doing it in this vague gesture. So the unions are not going to be stupid like they were in the 50s and 60s in pushing themselves against the black proletarian uprising of that era, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. I think like unions, they function as this like legal space of organizing, during times of like super exploitation, or like, it's just like the basics are met with it. There hasn't been an attempt, like worker control politics. I feel like, controlling the means of production, that's like the area of politics where I want to eventually, see some activity take place. And I think like historically, like the efficiency like of those sort of worker controlled outfits were pretty good, when you compare it to like, you know, the corporate capitalist sort of, state led model thing.
One thing I'm surprised you didn't kind of mention, Arturo, which I think is an interesting dynamic that I've observed, is I've observed a bit of a coalition between trans activists and George Floyd protesters at points, at other points a critique from people in a kind of Black Trans Lives Matter wing of the movement of the George Floyd protesters for not saying the names of Black trans people that were killed, like Tony McDade, and so that's one area that your piece did not speak on that I think that needs more examination. I was part of specifically efforts in my local area, and involved in specifically a trans focused dimension of these uprisings. I was involved in an event for Tony McDade, and Tony McDade is a name that doesn't get said enough in these instances, partially because he was a Black trans man, but also partially because he was not the ideal victim. Just like he was someone that was he was engaged in some activity that was criminalized, right? But he was engaged in some activity that was considered criminal, so that may be another reason outside of the trans issue why his name was not brought up to the forefront. And so I think that those internal conflicts, but also those internal coalitions, are should be talked about more, and I'm seeing more discussion of that in various parts of the community.
Interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think the piece definitely leaves that out. I think it's very like race and class centric, and that's a major limitation. Yeah, no, you're right.
It's just another dynamic that needs examination, in a certain place. And I respect that your knowledge and your background is not one that qualifies you to feel like you're going to write about that either. Also, that's not where you come from. So your expertise on that matter, it might also make you feel like that's not your place to talk about also, right? But still, it was brought up during the conversation between No Name and Boots Riley on the Haymarket Books cast 2 weeks ago as well. And so it's a continuing topic of discussion.
And yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot of trans comrades out there fighting. Like that was a major section of the rebellion,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, that's not being talked about.
So Arturo, I had another question. It was surrounding COVID. What were the implications of COVID on the rebellion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something also that is not really fleshed out in the piece. I mean, there's a point that mentions COVID, but I think it is kind of abstract and doesn't really
Mm-hmm.
go into detail. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a factor in why people are, feeling so alienated and just like fucked over by the government. Like lack of government assistance, I think, is a big part of why the looting. I think the looting especially was already on the table in the pandemic, with poor people not being able to get government assistance in the way that it kind of excludes the lowest levels of the working class. And because if you haven't been working, if you haven't been in some kind of like stable wage labor job, you're not really able to get government assistance.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, that I think that was a big part of what led to the rioting and the looting, and just a lot of pent up energy. Yeah, you
There's
can't.
a lot of pieces across various journals like It's Going Down or LibCom on the tactic of looting. Do you think it's sort of, in many ways it's become, sort of like Occupy was for a time, like looting is sort of a tactic, or it's something that's on the table, or is it deeply connected with like the spontaneity of how things develop on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, people that are poor, and you have all these businesses that are just closed, and with all these commodities sitting inside of them, I think it makes sense that looting would happen.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it is part of just the spontaneous self activity that happened. But I think there's also a limitation to looting. Like I feel like a lot of people are like cool with the protests and like the street riots, but some people were just like not okay with the looting.
Mm-hmm.
So that presents a limit on the people that are going to get behind the rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I mean, there's aspects of it that are very revolutionary. People looting things and just handing them out to the crowd and redistributing resources. But then there's
Yeah.
in Philly, you had looters fighting each other sometimes
Yeah.
and competing over those commodities and who was going to get them.
What's interesting to me is that as far as looting goes, a giant multinational like Target isn't actually worried about losing products, but you do see like smaller businesses, just like the threat of potential riots or looters, especially in DC, had a bunch of businesses closing, even longer than what the reopening guidelines were suggesting for COVID, and they were closed longer, and they had this plywood on their windows for a longer period of time. And so it's almost like more damaging than the looting itself is the threat of potential looting over a period of time, because it makes the commodity form inherently more unstable. It makes the investment in like stock more unstable. It kind of it puts into question the core assumptions of a working capitalist economy for as long as people are worried that it could happen. So it's so interesting how the risk of it is more scary to these businesses than in many instances when it does happen. It doesn't. It isn't. They're not going after smaller businesses. They're going after businesses that were, some of the worst looted or burnt down places were like Target and Wendy's, right? So that they weren't these places that were small little bookshops or something. In most cases, that they were multinational corporations that really Wendy's and Target are not going to be fucked, even though there might be a franchisee who owns one of those places who might, have something to lose. But overall, the multinational is not going to be fucked. And those people, even the franchisees have like insurance and stuff. And so it may not be so bad for them, but it's almost like the fear of it is worse because it makes these businesses feel uncomfortable even being open because they're afraid that having the doors open when a protest is coming by will lead people to go in there and necessarily, loot. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think like sort of the absurdity of how the state has dealt with it, right? Like, the threats of sending in the National Guard and, the army, and then declaring Antifa and our, other groups like terrorist organizations. And because I think like the system has been exposed, right? The capitalist, the capitalist sort of racist system has been exposed. And I think, it's also like sort of like Lenin once said, right? Typically, uh, when it becomes ungovernable at the top, from below, revolution begins. I think like, that's a major question, like if it is ungovernable, obviously the ruling class probably has other tactics, you know, to maintain its hegemony or whatever in that sort of circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, one thing that happened in Philadelphia that we don't really get into in the piece, and it's related to like how ruling class society maintains its hegemony, is the vigilante question. And in Philly, like you had mobs of mostly white people. It wasn't necessarily all white people, but it was mostly white people that were running around with like golf clubs and baseball bats, and also like submachine guns and shit, with the cooperation of the police and like the consent of the police.
Yeah.
Just like beating up protesters in the name of defending their neighborhoods from looters.
Yeah.
And people that would like set up.
Making America great, right?
Yeah. And that's, like there's been a lot of that in Philadelphia.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But I think that's, one of the strategies that the police state has at its disposal when it feels like it has kind of lost control of the situation. It's also willing to cooperate with these kind of like extra legal vigilante elements to maintain order. And like these guys will literally be running around like beating up what they perceive as like looters, or just which is basically just like anti-racist protesters that they get into arguments with, and the cops
Yeah.
will stand there and then arrest the people that they beat up afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. In New York, I heard they were in Atlanta. Actually, they were arresting people after they were leaving the protest or the area where the whole like scene was taking place. On their way home, they were just like arresting people. Yeah, it was crazy. And, the whole surreal scene of, the Atlanta mayor, who was, I think, like a progressive, quoting sort of MLK Jr. and creating MLK Jr. as like a non-radical figure, like a nationalist figure, right? On one side. And then you have like people on the ground who are sort of like, mobilizing MLK, and the whole revolutionary trajectory of the Black movement.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's absurd. It
Yeah,
completely
I was staying
erases.
in Denton, right, and that's like a Bible Belt area. Sorry, and over there had been this like racist sort of figure from Denton, and they had they got that removed, right, and there were like spontaneous protests, like Denton, like the main square was like filled up like 3 days in a row, 4 days in a row, you know, just like people coming out and the police using like every tactic to try to like control these crowds, right?
So just a final point to discuss. It would be interesting to try and use all this discussion to think about how and we take for granted that this is not going to be it. That the system is responding to this with the most fake, aestheticized versions of these bad faith commitments to reform. When this kind of thing happens again, what can leftist groups do to support, the self activity of the Black proletariat? I think that's a really good question that we should ask ourselves. And it sounds like with regards to the Delani question, that already it would be a good service to the rebelling Black proletariat if the white leftists or other folks became ready to deal with the white vigilantes, or
Mm-hmm.
would put effort into dealing with them, or holding them off at least for a period of time. But there must be other things we can gain from this about how can organizations respect the autonomy of the Black proletariat and not control what they do, but support what they're doing in these kind of instances,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, that's a really good concluding point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's a lot of answers, and all kinds of people can do all kinds of things and have the capacity to do very different things. I mean, yeah, I mean, in terms of just like tactical stuff, I think people need to, yeah, like you're saying, like just assume that riots are going to keep happening and prepare and train themselves accordingly. As much as that's in their capacity to do so. And then, I think there's a lot of like infrastructure that can be built to support that in terms of legal support, medical support, building media, and having study groups. And yeah, I mean, I think studying is really important too. People should be really like studying the history of revolutionary struggle and Black revolutionary struggle. And,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these questions have been hashed out before, and a lot of people have a lot to say about it in history. Um, Other stuff too, but right now that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, my point of view on this would be, firstly, I think it also like sort of highlights the sort of crisis of Marxism that's taking place, and the crisis of organizing that's taking place. I feel that if your primary mode of organizing is through like vanguardist or interventionist tactics, which ultimately become a debate about who controls the movement or not, I think that it could have a very counterproductive impact. And I think like you highlight that in the 25th one. I also think like the organizations have to truly become like anti-racist in nature. There should be some sort of like sort of attempt to like sort of develop a culture in that sense. And I think like with that, like the whole patriarchy within these organizations is also a major problem. But I think like the reductive reading is also a thing. So like I think the major gap is they aren't organized in communities. They haven't built up a solidarity. There's a rhetoric around like anti-racist slogans, but there hasn't been an actual attempt to make it a practice in everyday life. Uh, so I think like building that trust through solidarity would be my thing, to like help the autonomy of the Black revolutionary struggle.
Definitely. I think the discussion about the unions needing to take certain stances like that is partly a good attempt at what we're discussing here, which is solidarity, which doesn't which shows that these organizations are not about to put their own organizational language or theory or doctrine before solidarity with these uprising Black proletarians. That's already a role model, but there's also some role modeling that has to be done as far as groups that were putting out water, the mutual aid groups that were supporting people, and what was a very interesting image of solidarity to me was in my own city of DC, that there was someone who happened to live right in this area called Logan Circle, which was between where the initial protests went, and where the protesters were trying to escape the police, and he let I guess a number like 200 protesters into his house to help them escape tear gas from the police overnight, and so he let all these people, inside a little dwelling, and he just did it. It wasn't like a matter of him being organized to do it. It was this was just a random person just let people in there to help them escape tear gas, and so that's a model behavior. The unions, immediately going forward with proposals like, we're going to try and consider our connection to the police in various ways. That's a good modeling of some of the behaviors that have to get going. But also like Arturo was saying, like people have to, there wasn't, I feel like a good enough effort to reach out on kind of on behalf of organizations and give people kind of on the streets the resources and the tools, or the give them like gas masks, or give them
Yeah.
things that would help them in that struggle, or support them, and in fact, some of the outside agitator discourse we were talking about earlier, it was even suggesting that supporting the protesters, giving them tools to use to in their militant protest is an outside agitator action, which is just so absurd to me. So because the system has immediately called it out like that's almost an impetus for us to defend it more, because in certain contexts, like putting out supplies for people, putting out supporting people who are already out there, it's a really valuable action, and I do feel like the major organizations on the left, whether they be IWW or DSA or whatever, have not had a sustained effort for when these kind of things happen to create a kind of supply line from their middle class leftist rank and file to the Black proletarian people in the streets, and that definitely needs to change to truly be in solidarity with the autonomy of the Black proletariat. And so that's something that these organizations really need to do if they want to ensure that those spontaneous protests are more successful in the future, is to supply them with whatever they need, support them in every way possible, materially, spiritually, whatever way imaginable. So
Yeah. I think another really significant development that came out of this, which it didn't come out of nowhere, it happened in the past, is these like autonomous zones and these occupations of public space. Like
Mm-hmm.
it happened in Seattle, what people tried to do recently in DC,
Mm-hmm.
it seemed like it was very brutally repressed.
Mm-hmm.
There's also this like tent city that was set up in Philadelphia. It's like an encampment of like hundreds of homeless people
Yeah.
in Center City, Philadelphia, and that is kind of like connected the demand for housing with the demand to abolish the police. So,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's like a significant thing that I think is going to also happen in the future, that we should be ready to support, to show up there and be a part of.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of Seattle, I think that autonomous zone has been co-opted very, very rapidly as well. That
Right.
some of those activities can become kind of voyeuristic ventures for kind of white bourgeois activists to go there and see what's going on and get obligatory clout from it, which is why I was considering going, but I backed away once I saw that there was there wasn't a strong or mutual aid based or organization, and that there was a huge number of people who were just kind of milling around and weren't clearly actively organizing and supporting the voices that most need to be
trying
heard.
to get on democracy now.
Yeah. Oh yeah, a bunch of them for sure. So
yeah. That the co-optation, that's always a threat. With all this stuff.
Yeah, but interesting times. I do. Do you think this is a rupture point in the larger movement, or it's just like a continuation of a long-standing struggle?
I think what's very unprecedented is the multiracial nature of the riots, and that's something that I don't think has been seen on this kind of level.
That's interesting,
and that it is gonna shift the way that the subjectivities that have been created out of this situation and the experiences that people have had are gonna change things going forward.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. I think that a lot of people will be interested to hear this.
This has been a pleasure.
I hope to those who've heard or are listening that we've been respectful and self-critical about our attitudes and assumptions, and that we've tried to not control or own this event, which we've only gotten to observe mainly more than anything. So thank you everyone, and this has been an excellent second podcast for the Facing Autonomy podcast. Thank you so much, Arturo and Shir.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Zara. Thank you, Arturo.
All
Good night.
right.